I see Mr. Cooper has his hand up, so I am going to turn the floor over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to move a motion that the committee shall not proceed any further into clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-65 until it has dispensed with the motion that was moved and debated on Tuesday, November 26, 2024, and to refresh members of the committee as to the motion that was put forward by myself on Tuesday, November 26. It was a motion that calls on the Prime Minister's office, the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, the PMO and the PCO, essentially this government, to turn over all documents and communications relating to the secret meetings that were held with the NDP in drafting what has been sold to Canadians as being an elections bill, but what really is a pension bill in disguise, because it moves the date of the election back, and it, as a result of doing that, secures the pensions for MPs, many of whom are NDP and Liberal MPs who are likely to be defeated in the next election, who otherwise would not qualify for their pensions. And Mr. Chair, I'll seek your direction without ceding the floor. Would you like that the motion in our usual, as is the usual practice, be sent to all members, and then I could continue my remarks?
Yes, Mr. Cooper. I would very much appreciate, as I'm sure would all members, that a written copy of the amendment you've just, or the motion rather, that you've just presented, translated into both official languages, be sent. So until that is completed, I'm going to suspend, at which point you will maintain the floor and you can speak to it once it has been presented in both official languages to committee members. So,
point of order. Can I just get the confirmation of the speaking order after Mr. Cooper will have the floor back again? But I know there's been some hands up.
So the speaking order I had was Mr. Cooper, Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Calkins. That was the speaking order. Okay, so suspended briefly. I believe that all members have now received and had adequate time to consult the motion that was presented by Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper, you retain the floor, and I give it back to you in order to speak to the motion that you have presented to the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and just to put into the record, the motion that I had put forward on Tuesday, November 26, reads as follows: that given that the committee has learned that staff from the Prime Minister's office and the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs met with NDP party representatives, representatives from the PCO, and the Chief Electoral Officer on January 25, 2024, on matters relating to Bill C-65, and that the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs, along with his Parliamentary Secretary and staff from his office and the Parliamentary Secretary's office, met with NDP party representatives and NDP Member of Parliament, representatives from the PCO, and the Chief Electoral Officer on March 30th, 2024, on matters relating to Bill C-65, the committee, A, order the Office of the Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions, and Intergovernmental Affairs, and the PMO to provide the committee with all of the dates on which any representatives from the Liberal Party, including party officials, ministers, parliamentary secretaries, ministers' office staff, and members of Parliament, met with any representatives from the NDP, including party officials and members of Parliament, on matters relating to Bill C-65, and the names and titles of the individuals who attended those meetings, order the production of any documents under the control of the PCO, PMO, and any minister's office and Elections Canada, including any documents used as briefing materials in any of those meetings and any records of conversations, including emails, text messages, or any other form of communication about those meetings, and any records of discussions that took place at those meetings and or decisions that were made at those meetings, and that these documents are to be provided to the clerk with no redactions within 1 week of the adoption of this motion, and invite Daniel Blakey, former Member of Parliament for Elmwood Transcona and former Democratic Reform critic for the NDP and co-author of Bill C-65, to appear before the committee on its study of Bill C-65. Mr. Chair, it is important that we have from this government and their coalition partner, the NDP, transparency about what went on leading up to the tabling of Bill C-65, a bill that purports to be an elections bill, but which in fact is a pension bill in disguise. This is a government that snuck in a clause to this elections bill that pushes the date of the next federal election by 1 week. The basis upon which the date of the next election was moved back was purported to be on the basis that the current fixed election date conflicts with a holiday of cultural importance to certain diaspora communities in Canada. So that was the pretext. Now, one may say, well, okay, the election could be changed in light of that. I don't object to that. In fact, we Conservatives have been calling for a carbon tax election as soon as possible so that Canadians can have an opportunity to go to the polls and replace a government that has, for the past 9 years, been costly and corrupt, a government that really has lost, for all intents and purposes, the moral authority to govern, a government that Canadians cannot wait to see replaced. So, yes, we would like to see an election not on October of 2025, but an election as soon as possible. And it's why this week we're going to be moving a motion of non-confidence in this government so Canadians can get the carbon tax election that they want and the carbon tax election that they deserve. But be that as it may, going back to the bill and the purported reasons for moving the date of the next election back by a week, the Minister of Democratic Institutions, Dominic LeBlanc, asserted it was on the basis of avoiding a conflict with a holiday or a cultural holiday for certain communities. The election could have been moved back by a week. Instead, it could have been pushed ahead, rather, by a week, but we were told that that would conflict with Thanksgiving. If the election were moved back, moved ahead, rather, a week prior to that, it wouldn't conflict, as I understand, with anything. Or if it had been pushed back or pushed ahead, I keep saying pushed back, but I mean pushed ahead a week before that, again, there would be, I don't believe, any conflict. The point I'm making is that there was plenty of options on the table for the government to accommodate Canadians who celebrate this particular holiday, Diwali, without selecting the date that is provided for in this bill by pushing the date of the election back by 1 week. Now, one of the objections to moving the election ahead by 2 or 3 weeks instead of being pushed by 1 week, according to a representative, an official from the Prime Minister's Department, the PCO, when he appeared before this committee, speaking on behalf of the PCO, and therefore speaking on behalf of this government, was that this would, by pushing the election ahead by 2 or 3 weeks, that would result in the election getting into the summer period, conflicting with the Labor Day holiday. I believe he said the Labor Day holiday.
Summer holidays, Labor Day.
Summer holidays, Labor Day holidays, and that was something that the government wished to avoid. And one must, I found that a little bit unclear as to why specifically the government would want to avoid that. There have been many federal and provincial elections that have overlapped the Labor Day holiday. I can think of, for example, the 1990 Ontario election, when David Peterson, 3 years into his mandate, went to the polls. He had a big majority, I think 95 seats that he had won, the Liberals had won in the 1987 election. And that election, the 1987 election in Ontario, was in October. And so less than 3 years into his mandate, he made the decision to drop the writ in early August. It, in fact, not only overlapped the Labor Day holiday, it also overlapped the August long weekend. And the election, I stand to be corrected, but I believe it was on September 6, 1990, when David Peterson was severely punished for calling what Ontario voters perceived to be an opportunistic early election. And there was also a bad taste in the mouths of many Ontarians about the record of the Peterson government. There was a whiff of scandal and corruption that surrounded that Liberal government. If only the same could be said of these Liberals, that there is a whiff of scandal and corruption, because it's after 9 years of this Prime Minister, far more than a whiff of scandal. What we have with this government is a culture of corruption that goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister. We have a Prime Minister in that regard who has been found guilty not once, but twice, of violating the Conflict of Interest Act. We have a Prime Minister who obstructed an RCMP investigation into his potential criminal wrongdoing, including the fact that he may have and likely did obstruct justice when he completely improperly and likely illegally ordered his former Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, to intervene in the prosecution of SNC Lavalin. When the RCMP came before the Ethics Committee last spring, I asked them why they had suspended their investigation into the potential matter of obstruction of justice on the part of the Prime Minister. The RCMP, when I put it to them, whether it was as a result of the Prime Minister hiding behind cabinet confidence, whether that was a factor, they essentially answered in the affirmative. And when I asked whether, if for instance the cabinet confidence were lifted, whether that might lead the RCMP to reopen their investigation into what happened during SNC Lavalin, including the conduct of the Prime Minister, they said that that was possible. So we have a Prime Minister who, it's within his right to invoke cabinet confidence. I'm not suggesting otherwise. There are reasons for cabinet confidence, and there are legitimate reasons for invoking cabinet confidence. But in this particular case, while the Prime Minister has the right to invoke cabinet confidence, given what transpired during SNC Lavalin, given what we know, I think Canadians can judge for themselves about why the Prime Minister is invoking cabinet confidence. If the Prime Minister had nothing to hide, if he wasn't afraid that the RCMP could potentially lay charges against him for obstruction of justice, as well as potentially others in his office who were involved in putting pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould, and there were many in his office, right to the top of those in his office, including his then principal secretary, Gerald Butts, who had met with Jody Wilson-Raybould, I believe, more than once. Katie Telford, the Prime Minister's then Chief of Staff and current Chief of Staff, Matthew Bedard, among others. And if the Prime Minister wasn't fearful that either he or the likes of Telford and Butts had done nothing wrong, then why would he invoke cabinet confidence? Why would he obstruct an RCMP investigation? If the Prime Minister had nothing to hide, it follows that he would cooperate with the RCMP. He would let the RCMP do their job. He would let the RCMP follow the evidence and respect the independence of the RCMP to make a determination whether charges were warranted against the Prime Minister or anyone in his office for putting pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould to shut down the prosecution of SNC Lavalin, and therefore, in so doing, obstructed justice if the evidence demonstrated that it met that threshold. And I was on the Justice Committee during SNC Lavalin. I was the vice chair of the Justice Committee at the time. In fact, I can remember sitting down in the committee room below when Jody Wilson-Raybould came before a committee and gave her powerful testimony, really bombshell testimony of the
Monsieur le
type of
Président, point
pressure.
d'ordre.
Point of order. Point of order. I have been listening with great interest to what Mr. Cooper is saying, but I think that he's not. It's not relative to the motion, and I believe that we have to be discussing and debating the motion and its terms per se.
Merci. Mr. Cooper, if we can try to keep your remarks as close as possible to the nature of the motion, I think that would be appreciated. Thank you.
And I appreciate the comments made by Madame Fortier, but if I may, before I continue, to respond to her comments, to say that what I'm speaking of, which is a culture of corruption in this government, is pertinent to the motion. It's pertinent insofar as why I would submit there needs to be a carbon tax election, but also pertinent to the decision on the part of the Prime Minister in collaboration with the NDP, or the Minister, to push back the date of the next election, which we were really lacking in transparency. Essentially, the government tried to sell this bill as one thing when it in fact did another. And so I would submit that when we're talking about a lack of transparency, when we're talking about essentially presenting a fake bill to Canadians, and the need for an election and the timing of the next election, which is related to, which is pertinent to this very bill, because this bill does set the fixed date of the next election, that the record of this government, including the Prime Minister's culture of corruption that he has said, is pertinent. And there is, of course, wide latitude in these debates. And so, continuing where I left off, I can remember the very powerful testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould, and I can remember how she was treated by Liberal MPs, including the member for Edmonton Centre, Randy Boissonneau. I have some comments to make about him shortly, but I digress. The SNC Lavalin scandal was one that really shook public confidence in this Prime Minister and in this government. Really, ever since then, the Prime Minister has sat around sort of 33% support in 2019 going into the 2021 election. Of course, support for this government has plummeted now into the low 20s as Canadians are eager to see that an election be called, which is why I repeat that while I think the government could have moved ahead the election to have resolved the issue or the so-called problem that they asserted was the basis of pushing the election back, that we're really quite content to have an election as soon as possible. But going back to the Prime Minister, this is a Prime Minister who has in his cabinet ministers who violated the Conflict of Interest Act. Dominic LeBlanc, for example, the very minister who introduced this bill, he was found by the Ethics Commissioner to have violated the Conflict of Interest Act. Likewise, the Minister of International Trade is found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act. Bill Morneau, guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act. The member for Hull-Elmer, the Liberal member for Hull-Elmer, while he served as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, was found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act. And one must ask how it is that ministers of the Crown who were found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act are still in Cabinet. I mean, of a normal course, violating Conflict of Interest Act, I would submit, as a serious matter and ought to result in the immediate resignation of a minister. But, of course, for a prime minister who has been found...
Point of order. Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Berthold. Thank you very much, Chair. From the outset, we've had the opportunity to see that we have witnesses, we have officials here, and there's a second group of officials that have not yet been introduced. Will they be answering our questions at some point? Can we at least be introduced to them so that we know their names, their names rather? And we have people that are representatives of the government and also are.
Merci, Monsieur Berthold. On the same point of order, Mr. Turnbull.
Well, number one, that's not a point of order, Chair.
That
Number
is
two, I don't
correct.
think it's appropriate for the Conservatives to ask, as they filibuster their own motion, ask to be introduced to witnesses that are sitting in the committee, and even implying that they intend on asking witnesses questions today is just false pretenses at very best.
Monsieur Berthold, même appel au...
On the same point of order? No, it's only by way of courtesy, Mr. Chair, that I ask this question. I want to have the answer. It is not a point of order. It is not a point of order. I can say quite affirmatively.
I cannot, and that's, I'd ask all members that when they're raising points of order that they ensure that those are, in fact, points of order. Mr. Cooper, you retain the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have ministers in this government who were found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act, and that's a serious matter. That should be the grounds for the ministers who were found guilty of being immediately fired from Cabinet. But the Prime Minister has a problem because he's been found guilty twice. The Prime Minister is a serial lawbreaker. So what is a serial lawbreaker going to do about ministers who have also broken the law? Well, I guess he'd have to fire himself if he were to fire them. And Canadians would very much look forward to the opportunity to fire the Prime Minister if we can finally get on with having a carbon tax election. But, you know, speaking of this culture of corruption in this government, and I alluded to what I thought and many Canadians thought was the disgraceful performance of the member of for Edmonton Centre, the Liberal member, Mr. Boissonnault, when he insulted Jody Wilson-Raybould when she gave her powerful testimony before the Justice Committee in the spring of 2019. I can tell you that his performance at that committee hearing certainly contributed to his defeat in the 2019 election by the voters of Edmonton Centre. And I can tell you that if he puts his name on the ballot going into this next election, he'll be fighting for third place. But needless to say that Mr. Boissonnault resigned from Cabinet in disgrace 2 weeks ago. He resigned from Cabinet 2 weeks ago in disgrace. The minutes. Sorry, was there? Did you have a point? Okay, sorry, I apologize. Mr. Boissonnault has nonetheless a lot to answer for. And we're going to demand that Mr. Boissonnault come to committee and sit in front of committee and answer questions about some very serious matters. Indeed, he has, now that he has resigned from cabinet, he has now gone into hiding. He was scheduled to appear before the Ethics Committee on the very day that he resigned from cabinet. Coincidence? I think not. I think it was very well timed that he made the decision to resign because he didn't want to appear before the Ethics Committee, which is why we were debating yesterday in the House a concurrence motion to see that Mr. Boissonnault appear before INAC, specifically relating to the fact that his shady pandemic profiteering PPE company falsely and fraudulently misrepresented or held itself out as being a wholly Indigenous-owned company. Mr. Boissonnault's company held itself out with respect to 2 federal government contracts. Now, the government, the Liberals say, well, or at least they did say when Mr. Boissonnault was still sitting in cabinet, that there's nothing to see here because Mr. Boissonnault's shady pandemic profiteering PPE company didn't receive any contracts from the federal government. Well, good. I'm glad that his company, Global Health Imports, didn't receive contracts, but it misses the point, or at least part of the point, and in the case of Mr. Boissonnault, really the main point, which is that Mr. Boissonnault's company misrepresented itself as being wholly Indigenous owned. And that raised questions about his suitability, his fitness to serve in cabinet, because let's be clear about why Mr. Boissonnault's company held itself out as being wholly Indigenous owned. That was in a blatant attempt to give it an advantage in the government's procurement selection process. In short, what Mr. Boissonnault and his business partner, Mr. Anderson, sought to do was to steal contracts that would have gone to legitimately owned Indigenous businesses bidding on federal government contracts. It is about as low as it gets. It is cultural appropriation in its most offensive form, or among its most offensive forms, and it's fraud. Now, the Prime Minister stood behind Mr. Boissonnault in the face of that. The Prime Minister kept him in cabinet. The Prime Minister even went so far when he was at a conference in Brazil to publicly affirm his confidence in Minister Boissonnault, now former Minister Boissonnault, but then Minister Boissonnault. he did so notwithstanding the fact that it had been more than a week since Global News had reported on the fact that Mr. Boissonneau's company had held itself out falsely and fraudulently as being wholly Indigenous owned. And it's not as if Mr. Boissonneau denied that that had happened. Not at all. It's not in dispute that that is what his company did while he was active in the company, while he was one of two partners working at the company, handling its operations on a day-to-day basis, because this was before he had been returned to the House of Commons in 2021. This was, I believe, sometime in 2020, 2021, but prior to his return to the House of Commons. It was only when...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Romanato.
So while I allow my colleague to have a sip of his coffee, I just wanted to do a point of order saying this is not relevant to the motion at hand, but I wanted to give him a chance to take a sip of coffee. Thanks.
I would agree.
Point of order.
I've just, one moment, Mr. Duncan.
Yep.
I've just read through the motion again, Mr. Cooper, as you were speaking. I'm not sure I see relevance to Mr. Boissonneau and the motion you've presented. Perhaps you have an explanation, which will certainly give you the opportunity to do. But on this same point of order, Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just contribute to that, I respectfully disagree on relevance, but Mr. Cooper has been doing for the last several minutes, and sadly it takes some time because there are many examples of a culture of corruption and secrecy, not having access to the full information when it comes to the actions and conduct of the Liberal government. So
you're
it
venturing
may
into-
take some time, Mr. Chair, but they are
Mr.
relevant
Duncan, you are
in soliciting support for the
venturing into
motion.
debate now. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Yes, and it does take a long time, and Mr. Duncan is quite correct that when we look at the record of this government, there's a long list of scandals. In fact, I had my staff go back and look at all of the scandals of this government over the past 9 years, and through my team going back and going through and chronicling the various scandals, we came up with a list of 77 scandals, 78 scandals. And I think, while I want to continue on Boissonneau, I think it's important to perhaps identify what some of those scandals are, but I'll do that later. What I will say with Mr. Boissonneau is that only when the Edmonton Police announced that they were launching a criminal investigation, and only when Mr. Boissonneau was to appear
Mr.
before...
Cooper, I'm going to interject here again on the point of order that was raised by Ms. Romanato a moment ago. I'm going to ask you to get to the point that you're making about Mr. Boissonneau and the relationship that you see between those affairs and the motion at hand. Thank you.
Where I'm going is that Mr. Boissonneau is the latest example of misconduct on the part of ministers, and it represents the type of corruption and lack of ethical behavior that we see on the part of this government, which speaks to the need for there to be an election. So while Bill C-65 pushes the election back, we need to move the election ahead, and we need to understand why the NDP, in collaboration with the Liberals, drafted a bill to push the election back. And in that regard, Mr. Boissonneau, he has resigned from cabinet, but Prime Minister, as part of his culture of corruption, defended him. It defended him not just for about a week when the matter of his company falsely representing itself as being Indigenous, but also for months, notwithstanding that there were very, very serious allegations against Mr. Boissonnault, including what we've seen from a number of ministers in this government, including the First Minister, the Prime Minister, is that he almost certainly violated the Conflict of Interest Act. He almost certainly violated the Conflict of Interest Act when text messages revealed that someone named Randy at Global Health Imports was involved in the operations of the company. While
Mr. Cooper, I'm going to interject again. I don't want to be forced into a situation between you and I where I have to make a more stern ruling on relevance, but I would ask that you get back to the motion. You have indicated that you believe the relevance is founded in a connection to the corruption that you allege has taken part by government officials and Mr. Boissonnault. However, again, I'm reading very clearly the terms of the motion you put forward, which is what we are, of course, debating at the moment. And I would ask that you get there. There will only be so many times that I'm going to afford the opportunity for you to say, I'm getting there. So I would ask that you get there. And of course, the floor is always yours to speak to the relevance of the motion, but you are skirting that territory pretty clearly here. Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Point of order, if I may, Mr. Chair.
You may, Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Chair. I, for one, am enjoying the testimony of my colleague or the comments by Mr. Cooper. And, Mr. Chair, I think you'll find that the relevance is rooted in the notion of one of trust and one of corruption, where a government and it's not only itself and its friends have been implicated numerous times in matters of self-interest. And this bill directly has in it a clause that is and can be and has been widely interpreted as a matter of self-interest.
Mr. Calkins, I'll ask that you get to a point of order, and just for your benefit, we're not debating a clause in a bill, we're debating a motion. So unless you can speak specifically to the clause in the motion that you think is relevant to what I'm telling Mr. Cooper I think he's veering away from, then I don't see a point of order here.
Mr. Chair, is that Mr. Cooper is bang on in his notion that we need to hear from more witnesses in order to establish whether or not the intentions behind the clauses in the legislation have been duly heard by members of this committee. I'm looking forward to Mr. Cooper's
Okay,
continued
I
testimony.
am not hearing a point of order. I appreciate your interpretation, Mr. Calkins. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
you, Mr. Chair, and I take your point. I would submit I have wide latitude, but at your request of moving closer to the specific text of the motion, we have a bill that was drafted behind closed doors with the NDP. And the bill pushes back the date of the next election. And it was purported that the basis upon which pushing the date of that election back was to avoid a conflict with a cultural holiday. And as I had stated before, there was no reason why the election could have been moved ahead rather than back to have avoided that conflict. The clerk, not the clerk, but an official from the PCO said that the election could not be pushed ahead by 1 week, or if it did, that would conflict with Thanksgiving. Okay. I think most Canadians would agree they would not want to see an election over the Thanksgiving weekend. But if the election were pushed ahead a week before that or 2 weeks before that, then Mr. Sutherland from the PCO from the Prime Minister's Department said that that would go into the summer. And as I cited with the example of the 1990 Ontario election, there are plenty of examples of elections over the summer. Indeed, the election, my first election in 2015, started in late July and concluded in October. Now, one can question whether that was the best decision to have an election at that time, but nonetheless, the election was called in the summer. So there's plenty of precedent for it. And what is most ironic about this government using summer as an excuse to push the date of the election 1 week back, rather to avoid a summer election, is the fact that when was the last time we had an election that was called in the summer? I don't know if anyone can remember, but those who can't remember obviously have short memories, because every member sitting in this committee contested that election, and that was the last election called by the Prime Minister when he took, when he was, again, as part of another cover-up on the part of the Prime Minister relating to the national security leak at the Winnipeg lab. The Prime Minister hid documents, refused to turn over documents ordered by Parliament. Sound familiar? And took the Speaker, the Liberal member for Nipissing Temiskaming, to court to stop those documents from being turned over to Parliament, and then called an election to cover up the massive national security leak at the Winnipeg lab. And so it's quite unbelievable that a government, a Liberal government, that as recently as 3 years ago, the most recent election, called an election during the summer.
Yeah, that was okay. That was okay.
Now says, oh no, we can't push the date of the election ahead to avoid a conflict with the cultural holiday because it might encroach into part of the summer. It simply doesn't stand up to basic scrutiny. It is simply not credible. And it's not credible because it wasn't the reason why the Liberals, with the support and collaboration of the NDP, picked the date provided for in Bill C-65 to move the election back, not forward. There is another reason cited by the minister was on the need to change the date and move it ahead, is that the current date, the current fixed date, would not only conflict with a cultural holiday, but it would conflict with municipal elections in the province of Alberta. I understand that that could potentially be an issue, something that might best be avoided, hence the need to change the date. But if that is the reason, then why is it that the government, the Liberals, chose a date that conflicts with the territorial election in Nunavut. I mean, if the objective is to avoid having two elections on the same day, as was purported to be the secondary reason for the change in date, then why would the date that the government chose as substitute for the current fixed date be one that does exactly that, conflicts with another election, a territorial election? It would seem to me that this is just the latest, nothing more than an excuse, an effort to try to justify the reasons and provide reasons that were not, in fact, the reasons for the date that the government chose. But the date that the Liberals chose, with the assistance of the NDP in drafting the bill, just happens to be a date when MPs elected in 2019 would suddenly qualify for their pensions. Now, why would the Liberals and the NDP want to do that? Well, very simply, we have a prime minister who is the most unpopular prime minister in a generation. One would have to go back to the early 1990s, or back to, frankly, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I think, in fact, I stand to be corrected. I think polling might suggest the last prime minister who was as unpopular or more unpopular than the current prime minister was Pierre Trudeau. So we have a very unpopular prime minister and an NDP that for more than 2 years has been part of the coalition. 3 years, sorry, more than 3 years with this unpopular prime minister, and has at every opportunity propped up this costly and corrupt Liberal government. And accordingly, the NDP is not doing well in the polls either. Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau can certainly see where things are headed whenever an election is held, and it doesn't look good for either Justin Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh. And so Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau have a problem on their hands with respect to the current fixed date, and that is that many Liberal and NDP MPs who face almost certain electoral defeat, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but based on every piece of information one can gather in terms of assessing where the mood of the public is at, and where the mood of the public was at when this bill was drafted, that was a very, very strong probability that many Liberal and NDP MPs elected in 2019 who wouldn't qualify for their pensions would not be returned to the House of Commons whenever the next election is held. And so, by moving the date back, suddenly these Liberal and NDP MPs who face almost certain electoral defeat will suddenly qualify for their pension. Canadians are not unaware of this. Canadians immediately recognized the change in date for what it is, and that is that this bill This fake elections bill is a pensions bill. It is a desperate attempt by the Liberals and NDP to pad their pockets on their way out. It is cynical. It is dishonest. And it speaks to, frankly, why the sooner we can have an election to replace this government and their coalition partner, the better. And Canadians are not buying the pretexts offered by the Liberals about why they changed the date, because we heard their excuses, their justifications of why they changed the date. They said it conflicted with a holiday. Then they said, well, we moved it to the date to avoid conflicting with a municipal election, but the date we chose conflicts with a territorial election. We moved the date a week back to avoid going into summer, yet they were happy to call an election in the summer when they wanted to cover up the national security breach at the Winnipeg lab. And yet they say with a straight face, despite the explanations that they have offered having no credibility and not making any sense, they say unequivocally it had nothing to do with pensions.
Just a coincidence.
It was just a coincidence. I mean, come on. No one believes the Prime Minister, no one believes the Liberals, and no one believes Jagmeet Singh on this one.
On many things.
And I think it would be helpful just to get a sampling of some of the feedback that I've received from Canadians outraged at this NDP Liberal pension grab. One Canadian wrote to me, as a tax-paying citizen of this country, technically your boss, it has come to my attention that the Trudeau government wants to delay the next scheduled election by 1 week so that he can give dozens of politicians a taxpayer-funded pension to the tune of $120 million. This may not seem significant to the Trudeau government, given how he has taken our tax dollars and spent it on initiatives that have zero to no value to us. All the tax-paying citizen, all of you need to do the right thing and stop this disrespectful plan by the Trudeau government to take our hard-earned dollars, $120 million, and give it to politicians that do not deserve it. The Trudeau government has proven over the past 9 years that they do not care about the well-being of Canadian citizens, only themselves, and this is just another example of that. Do the right thing and don't allow this plan to happen.
Point of order, Chair.
Mr. Turnbull on a point of order.
There are over 40 amendments in our amendment package that deal specifically with the date of the election, all of which on this side have said that they would support a change to that. So Mr. Cooper maybe could stop his filibuster and actually let us move on to clause by clause. We could actually deal with the very issue that he's filibustering about.
I appreciate your commentary, Mr. Turnbull, but I will remind you, as I did our colleagues on the other side of the table, that that is not a legitimate point of order. So I ask members to please make sure that points of orders are consistent with the rules. Mr. Cooper?
Yes, and the motion, it's fine and well that there are amendments to the bill. Conservatives have submitted all kinds of amendments with respect to the date of the next election to move it so that we can have an election as soon as possible. And I would hope that we don't even get to those amendments, that we simply have a vote of non-confidence in the House of Commons following the Conservative Opposition Day motion for there to be a carbon tax election. and the ball is very much in the court of up to the NDP, because it is the NDP who has said, Jagmeet Singh, who has said that the
Point
Prime
of order,
Minister-
Chair. I'm still struggling to understand the relevance. Relevance is a point of order. I think we're all aware of that point of order. But the motion that Mr. Cooper has moved in this committee is essentially saying that we shouldn't move to clause by clause until we've dispensed with his previous motion. So what's his argument here, and how is it relevant to that particular motion? It doesn't seem to fit.
Relevance is a legitimate point of order, and Mr. Cooper, you're about to get the floor back, and perhaps you want to take a couple seconds to address the question of relevance raised by Mr. Turnbull, but I'm going to allow you to continue, and we'll keep a close ear to the ground on how far you may be veering away from the relevance of the motion.
The fact is that this was a cynical, dishonest attempt by the Liberals and the NDP to pad their pockets with pensions. They sold it as an elections bill.
Point of order, Chair.
Canadians are outraged about this, and Canadians deserve
Mr.
answers.
Turnbull on a point of
I
order.
believe there's another standing order that talks about impugning the motives of another member of Parliament. I think Ms. Romanato knows that standing order number 18. I would suggest that Mr. Cooper's claims that he's made not only are false, but impugn the motives of other members of Parliament, and I think you should retract those statements. And I would encourage you to ask him to do so as our devoted chair, sir.
Well, it's always nice to be recognized for devotion to a shared cause, so thank you for that, Mr. Turnbull. I will keep a close ear on whether or not I believe that there's been a violation of Standing Order 18. Mr. Cooper, you're an experienced parliamentarian who surely is aware of where that line exists. So I am going to turn the floor back over to you. I am not going to ask for a retraction at this point, but as per Mr. Turnbull's point of order, if we can keep relevant and be careful about the skirting of that standing order, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I can appreciate that Mr. Turnbull doesn't want to be reminded of the many Canadians who have expressed outrage at this cynical attempt to secure pensions for soon-to-be defeated Liberal and NDP MPs under the guise of an elections bill. But I want the voices of Canadians who have expressed their outrage to have their voices heard, including some of those who wrote to me who provided their views on the matter to be read into the record. And so in that regard, I will continue. Another Canadian who wrote to me says it takes the average person 40-plus years of working before they can get a company pension. Same amount if they want to get a decent CPP or OAS pension. 2 million Canadians survive because they have other Canadians providing to go to the food banks so that they can survive. The government wants to change election date so politicians can get an early pension. How many years have these politicians actually worked to get these pensions? 40 years? I think not, other than Louis Plamondon. That's my, I guess, editorial to that, because he has been here for 40 years, since I was born in 1984. Do the right thing, leave the federal election as is, and make those politicians earn their pensions like the rest of Canadians
Chair.
have to.
That's exactly what we're trying to do here, Chair, with the amendments to the bill, C-65. That's what we were here to do. That's what we were scheduled to do today. That's what witnesses have given up their time to do. It would be nice if Mr. Cooper would let us actually amend the bill to take out the very issue that he's referring to.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Mr. Turnbull. That is not a legitimate point of order. So I will ask members to ensure that they... Colleagues, if we can just keep our crosstalk down, please, for the benefit of our interpreters. That was not a legitimate point of order, Mr. Turnbull. I'd ask that you reflect prior to raising your hand for a point of order. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Another Canadian wrote, please stop political pensions and the weak delay in voting. A great majority of Canadians are struggling to survive. Please help us. Justin T. must go. Bring common sense back. Another said, It's bad enough that the NDP Liberal coalition is continuing to prop up this unwanted government. Do not allow the due process of mandatory elections delay an extra week just to enable MPs to illegally get their pensions. If these same politicians were honoring their mandate and governing in the best interests of their constituents, we would have had an election by now. Let them run on their political record and see if the people of Canada want these folks reelected. My thoughts are that they have absolutely no chance at that. Stop election interference and do not delay our long overdue elections. And I could go on because my office has received thousands and thousands of emails from Canadians, and I suspect my colleagues across the way on the Liberal side and in the NDP have also heard from many Canadians who have made their voices heard. Now, Mr. Turnbull has said that, well, why don't we just get on to amending the bill? Yes, I would like to amend the bill. I have put forward, Conservatives have put forward a number of amendments to amend this very bad bill, including with respect to the date of the next election. But Mr. Turnbull is perhaps missing the point of the motion. Now that the NDP and the Liberals got caught with this pension grab, they have said it's one big misunderstanding. Even though we drafted a bill that by no coincidence just happens to be the date in which soon-to-be defeated NDP and Liberal MPs get their pensions, they now say, oh, well, actually, we don't support having the election changed to that specific date. We're not interested in our pensions anymore now that they've been caught. That's what they've been saying. I'm not so sure that's what the Liberals have been saying, but that's what Jagmeet Singh has been saying, is that it's all one big misunderstanding. Well, if that's the case, then there are motions that or amendments that Conservatives have put forward that I would hope the NDP will support, that would support their rather convenient assertion that it's all one big misunderstanding, which up until now no one believes. But simply to say, well, now that we've been caught...
Not to give Mr. Cooper a break or anything, but I wondered if we could release the witnesses, just given the fact that Mr. Cooper has been filibustering for about an hour and a half now. And I'm just not very confident that we're going to get to use their valuable time today and their expertise, so perhaps we should let those witnesses go.
I
mean, Mr.
appreciate-
Cooper clearly intends to continue this until the end of the meeting, I'm sure.
I appreciate your sentiment, Mr. Turnbull. I did speak to the witnesses prior to the beginning of the meeting and subsequently once we began. And although I am sympathetic, should there be a change in the direction, we have so few meetings to deal with this legislation that I'm not prepared to let them go at the moment. So witnesses, I apologize, but I am going to ask you to stay in the event that we do move forward with clause by clause. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chair, for the Liberals to say, well, we'll just move to clause by clause, misses the point of this motion, because what this motion demands is that there be a level of accountability for this cynical and dishonest attempt to secure pensions for soon-to-be defeated Liberal and NDP MPs. And it's important to note the history of the drafting of this pension bill disguised, or rather this elections bill that has been disguised as a that it really is a pension bill in disguise, because we know that the NDP were heavily involved in drafting this bill. For all intents and purposes, the NDP critic, former Member of Parliament Daniel Blaikie, was the co-author of this bill. Mr. Blaikie is quoted in a CTV news article on January 27th, 2024, saying that a fair amount of work has been done towards drafting what is now Bill C-65. The headline being, Trudeau and Singh's teams quietly planning electoral reform legislation. Mr. Blaikie stood side by side Minister LeBlanc after Minister LeBlanc tabled the bill at the press conference that Mr. LeBlanc convened, as he tried to sell Canadians on the fact that the date of the election had been changed to avoid conflicting with a cultural holiday. And Mr. Blaikie and the NDP were in on it. They were working hand in glove with the Liberals, with Minister LeBlanc. And that's not speculation. I mean, it's obvious when Daniel Blaikie said a fair amount of work has been done towards drafting a bill, and then shows up and stands side by side Minister LeBlanc. But we also have learned, as a result of the appearance of Mr. Sutherland from the Privy Council office, as well as the Chief Electoral Officer, Mr. Perot, that there were secret meetings held between this Liberal government and the NDP with the Chief Electoral Officer, specifically around the drafting of this bill. And I would note that based upon the submission of the Chief Electoral Officer, there were two meetings involving this Liberal government, the NDP, and the Chief Electoral Officer. One meeting was on January 25th. January 25th, which just happens to be 2 days before Daniel Blaikie was quoted as saying that a fair amount of work had been done towards drafting the bill. At that January 25th meeting with the Chief Electoral Officer were staff from the Prime Minister's office, staff from the Minister's office, staff from the Prime Minister's Department, the PCO, and staff from Elections Canada. So that was the first meeting. And the second meeting being held on March 30th. At that meeting, in addition to the Chief Electoral Officer being present, were Minister Dominic LeBlanc, the co-author of this bill, NDP MP Daniel Blaikie, the Parliamentary Secretary to Minister LeBlanc, Jennifer O'Connell, staff of the Minister's office, staff from the PCO, staff from MP Blaikie's office, and I assume it says staff from the MP's office, so I presume that is in reference to Daniel Blaikie's staff being present, and staff from Elections Canada. These are, I must say, unusual meetings. To have a meeting with the chief electoral officer, the minister, officials from the Prime Minister's office, the PCO, meeting with Daniel Blaikie, the NDP MP, except for the fact that perhaps it's not a surprise insofar as Daniel Blaikie and the NDP were working hand in hand with the Liberals in drafting this bill, this elections bill that is really a pensions bill. And it's even more unusual to see that there was a meeting between the chief electoral officer and staff from the Prime Minister's office, the Minister's office, the PCO, and Elections Canada with the executive director of the NDP, Anne McGrath, about specifically relating to the drafting of this elections bill that is really a pensions bill. I can assure you, Mr. Chair, that I had no such meetings with the chief electoral officer. I've met with the chief electoral officer. We've had courtesy meetings. We've discussed his report on the 2019 and 2021 election. We talked about the pilot project in Nunavut. We've talked about a number of issues in my capacity as the Shadow Minister for Democratic Reform. But I can assure you that I was not invited as the Shadow Minister for Democratic Reform to sit down with Minister LeBlanc, officials in staff in the Prime Minister's office, officials in the PCO, along with the chief electoral officer relating to the drafting of this bill. That invitation was not given to me. I am certain it was not given to Madame Goudreau. And, but there we have it. At least 2 meetings between the minister, the Prime Minister's staff, and Chief Electoral Officer with Daniel Blaikie from the NDP and the Executive Director of the NDP. And the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, acts as if he knew nothing about this pension grab. That it's all one big misunderstanding, but there was his critic, Mr. Blaikie, the executive director of the party, of the NDP, in the thick of it, working hand in glove with the Prime Minister's office and the Minister's office. And these 2 meetings were only with the chief electoral officer. There were clearly many more meetings between the Liberals and the NDP, because after all, the first meeting with the chief electoral officer of the 2 was on January 25th. On January 27th, Mr. Blaikie was quoted as saying a fair amount of work had already been done. So obviously there were many meetings and communications prior to the meeting with the chief electoral officer. So Canadians deserve to know, what were those communications? How many meetings did the NDP have with the minister, the minister's staff, the Prime Minister's office, with the Prime Minister's department, the PCO, in drafting this bill that includes this pension grab that is going to put taxpayers on the hook in the amount of tens of millions of dollars to pad the pockets of soon-to-be defeated Liberal and NDP MPs. And that is what this motion gets to. It gets to transparency so that Canadians can have a clearer picture about what happened in the lead up to the drafting of this pension bill.
Appel au règlement,
And-
Monsieur le Président.
Point of order. Point of order, Chair. Yes, Mr. Berthold. I have been listening now to my colleague for some time now, but it seems quite clear that one of the issues is the appearance of Mr. Daniel Blakey as a witness. And if I refer to the standing orders, Standing Order 122 that says if a member requires that a person appear before the committee is an essential member. It is Standing Order 122. This is just debate, Mr. Berthold. No, it's not debate.
Je te donne un autre 10 secondes pour...
I'll give you another 10 seconds to give me something concrete as to the point of order. Mr. No, I'll let him go ahead. Let him go ahead. Excellent.
Chair, and so this motion will see that there is that transparency that Canadians deserve by seeing that the documents and other communications between the NDP and Minister LeBlanc, his staff, the Prime Minister's office, the Prime Minister's Department of PCO, and Elections Canada be produced so we can understand how it is that this clause that moves the date of the next election back was incorporated, and to get a better understanding of what is really a less than to see that we can get an understanding of exactly what these discussions, these unusual discussions between the NDP and the Liberals were. And also to hear from Daniel Blakey, the co-author of the bill. We heard from one of the two co-authors, Minister LeBlanc. I think it's important that this committee hear from the other co-author of the bill. Mr. Blakey is someone who has certainly a great understanding of Canada Elections Act, in my experience, and I think he served on this committee for some time. So it would be good to hear from him and his insights into this bill, and to address some of the issues that we see with the bill, and most importantly, to explain how it is, why it is, that he was working hand in hand with the Liberals to push the date of the next election back. And it's important to ask who first decided to incorporate this clause into the bill. Was it the NDP or was it the Liberals? Because we know that they're both desperate. We know that the Prime Minister is very, very unpopular. We know Jagmeet Singh is very, very unpopular. We know that Canadians are excited about defeating both the NDP and the Liberals in the next election, and they know that so many of their MPs aren't coming back, won't qualify for their pension. So it'd be very interesting to know who raised the pension issue, and that's part of what this motion seeks to get to. And I know that when we had the chief electoral officer appear before a committee, he was asked whether the issue of Diwali and the fact that the current fixed date conflicts with Diwali was brought up. And he said it was not brought up. So if the government's pretext for changing this date was Diwali, if that in fact is the true basis for which they have decided to push the date of the next election back, it is rather surprising that that would not have come up with the chief electoral officer. But then again, it's not surprising because we know that the real reason for changing the date of the next election, for pushing the date of the next election back, is to secure the pensions of soon-to-be-defeated Liberal and NDP MPs, to pad their pockets, and it's going to cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. And I want to say, with respect to this motion, that it's important that we get all of the documents. And this motion is specific insofar as not only that we get all the documents, but we get all of the documents on an unredacted basis, because this government has a history, and not a very good history, of responding to motions passed by parliamentary committees, including this committee, and by the House of Commons itself, by saying, oh, well, here are the documents, but they're all full of black ink, blacked out, full of redactions. And I can only presume, based on the track record of this government, that if anything less than demanding that the documents be turned over on an unredacted basis would result in documents being blacked out. And I have to say, I'm not optimistic that if this motion were adopted, that we would see all of the documents, but we need to see all of the documents. I have to say it is, this committee passed a motion for the government to turn over documents relating to the ATP 31 hacking or incident, and that was passed in June, and the order of this committee was for the government to turn over all relevant documents by August the 9th. It's now December 2nd or December 3rd, and we still don't have all of the documents. In fact, the understanding I have is that there is a sizable number of documents that still haven't been provided to this committee. And so it speaks to a level of contempt, or certainly a lack of respect on the part of this government to parliamentary committees and orders of parliamentary committees. And that is in respect of a matter that happens to concern all, should concern all members of parliament, and that is that members were targeted by the Beijing-based regime. And so, while I'm not optimistic that if this motion passes, this government will turn over all communications, I would say that if the Prime Minister were true to his word that sunshine is the best disinfectant, and if it truly is one big misunderstanding, as Jagmeet Singh and the NDP would have Canadians believe, about the fact that this bill pushes the date of the next election back to just very coincidentally a date that secures the pensions of his soon-to-be defeated NDP MPs, as well as, of course, the many soon-to-be defeated Liberal MPs, then the NDP and the Liberals would support this motion. They would support transparency. They would support the release of the documents, and they would support us hearing from Daniel Blaikie. And with that, I would welcome any other comments, but I would hope that we can get this to a vote so that Canadians can get the transparency that they deserve, and we can get to the bottom of what happened and who asked. Was it the NDP or the Liberals for the pension clause to be added to this bill? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Turnbull, you were next on our speaking order.
Wonderful. I was beginning to give up hope that I would get the chance to take the floor today, but I'm glad I get the chance. And I'm glad Mr. Cooper has finished his filibuster and is finished hopefully delaying on getting to clause by clause, which I know is what was scheduled today for our committee. And I know that our time is precious, or it didn't feel that way for the last almost 2 hours, but I feel like my time is precious. I don't know about Mr. Cooper, but I see him smiling over there. I'm sure he doesn't mind wasting the committee's time with long, arduous filibusters that we all have to listen to while witnesses are sitting here, painfully waiting to get on to clause-by-clause analysis. What's interesting, though, is that, and I said this in one of my points of order, which was probably not exactly in the standing orders, but at least I got to make a small interjection to give Mr. Cooper a chance to sip his coffee. But, the Conservatives say they want an election. They want an election right now. They want an election tomorrow. They want an election yesterday. What's interesting is that this bill, C-65, deals with a whole bunch of things that Conservatives, even though they want an election, don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with the fact that the very thing that they keep pointing to is an amendment that the NDP have put forward that would remove the fixed election date and revert back to the way it was before.
Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Turnbull, I have a point of order from Mr. Calkins.
Oh, wonderful. I hope he cites the standing order.
Chair, could you advise the committee as to the status of amendments and their confidentiality prior to them being moved at committee? Because Mr. Turnbull just addressed, I believe, an amendment that has not yet been moved, and I'm wondering if he is in violation of our standing orders.
Exactly.
Just give me one moment, please. Okay, thank you, Mr. Calkins. I'm not sure, Mr. Turnbull, I didn't catch it, if you were referring to your own amendment or if you were referring to another one. So it's just a reminder to colleagues about the rules cited by Mr. Calkins a moment ago, that we do have to be very careful about the way in which we reference amendments that have been presented but not moved. Thank you, Mr. Calkins, for raising this. Mr. Turnbull, the floor remains yours.
I mean, I know that other members in this committee have spoken about amending the very thing in general that the Conservatives have claimed to be so concerned about in this committee, and which is the subject of some, at least, of Mr. Cooper's filibuster today. But let's just be honest, the point is moot, because they won't actually get on to actually the substance of the bill. Why? Because they would rather keep their false narrative alive rather than actually get down to the substantial considerations of a major piece of legislation which deals with the very issue that they've talked about and deals with a whole bunch of other issues that historically Conservatives don't want to deal with, which is like voter disenfranchisement and participation. Oh, sorry, Chair, I was just getting warmed up.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I have I have a point of order. Appel au règlement, Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Berthold? Yes, as Mr. Turnbull said earlier in the meeting, we can't impugn motives of a colleague, but that he has just brought this up. He's in the process of doing the very same thing that he referred to a little earlier today. Chair, it's not true. In actual fact, what we are presenting here is our thinking, and what is the thinking as to how we should conduct ourselves in terms of C-65. Thank you, sir. I don't know if I'm in complete agreement with you, but certainly I would say I've offered leeway to this side here. I will caution Mr. Turnbull, but allow the same leeway.
I wasn't even close to the line, though, in terms of expressing myself with my parliamentary privilege, which I have every right to do. We just listened to Mr. Cooper make all kinds of false claims in his diatribe for the last 2 hours. In his false narrative, claiming all kinds of things about colleagues of mine, all kinds of things about the Prime Minister, all kinds of things about our party that are all false. They're all false statements, Mr. Berthold, and I sat here and listened to that, so you can listen to me now, and just as I did respectfully to you and your colleagues. So let's just be honest, the Conservatives don't seem to want to deal with helping our seniors access, like that's what the substance of this bill does, is help our seniors at long-term care facilities be able to access their right to vote in the federal election, or making our campus voting for students a reality and ensuring that those things become permanent. There are all kinds of other aspects of this bill that increase voter participation, something historically Conservatives don't like to support. We've seen that they seem to always vote against or try to cut down things that increase voter participation. They'd prefer to have people disenfranchised so that their likelihood of success is improved somehow. Let's also be honest, with the news breaking yesterday on foreign interference in the Conservative Party leadership race, I'm sure that's why the Conservatives don't want to deal with substantive issues in this bill that deal with foreign interference. There's numerous aspects of this bill, including a ban on disinformation intended to disrupt the conduct of elections, removing the time frame limit for offenses involving impersonation and false statements. Boy, that would open the Conservatives up to a number of different infractions, I guess. It would, the bill also ensures malicious actions using artificial intelligence are captured. It safeguards against foreign, untraceable, and difficult to trace donations, prohibits aiding or abetting a violation, and others. So there's a number of other ways in which this bill deals substantively with foreign interference. Putting safeguards in place should be of all of our interest, but of course they would rather do something else, which is go on a fishing expedition. They don't want to deal with the substantive issues that this bill includes. I wonder, whether a ban on disinformation is really what they're really concerned about, because that seems to be what their entire narrative is based around. Everything that seems to come out of the Conservative Party these days is based on disinformation.
Mr. Turnbull, I have a point of order from Mr.
Just
Duncan.
on decorum of the committee, Mr. Turnbull is making, I'm not offended, I don't spread misinformation. It's his colleague, Mr. Gerritsen, that's a member of this committee, that's the one that's had to pay $1,000 fine and admit and apologize for spreading misinformation.
All right,
Mr.
colleagues,
Turnbull should...
Mr. Duncan, not a point of order. But the good news is we're out of time, colleagues. Meeting adjourned.